Good evening and welcome to everybody joining us for the final Law and Contemporary Challenges evening webinar conversation entitled Irish Reunification, Challenges and Opportunities. These conversations are being held as part of Inspiring Generations, the campaign for Trinity College. My name is Gareth Crowe, and on behalf of Trinity Development and Alumni and the Trinity Law School, I'm so pleased that you could join us this evening to discuss an issue so relevant to our time and to our shared future. Just before we start, I'd just like to run through a few small technical items if I could. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, you can view this conversation in full screen on the top right-hand side of your screen. You can also adjust the audio setting on the bottom left, and you can leave the session on the bottom right. We really do encourage you, if possible, to submit some questions throughout the webinar. You can do this using the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. Our speakers will do their best to respond to all of your questions later on in the webinar. May I now introduce you to this evening's MC to begin our proceedings. Professor Yvonne Scannell is an emeritus professor in the School of Law in Trinity College, Dublin, one of Europe's foremost experts on environmental and planning law, and a former judge of the European Nuclear Energy Tribunal at the OCED in Paris.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to you all, and especially to our alumni. Now, this evening's topic is about Irish reunification. And those of you who have watched the legislative mess in the United Kingdom will be consoled to know that this is a topic which is being researched and discussed by scholars all over the world. And this evening, two of these scholars will be talking about this topic. The two speakers this evening are Professor Brendan O'Leary and Professor Oran Doyle. Professor O'Leary is a professor of political science in the University of Pennsylvania and a visiting professor in Queen's University, Belfast. He has written over 28 books, but his magnum opus is a series called A Treatise on Northern Ireland, published by Oxford University Press. And they, not Professor O'Leary, have described this as a breathtakingly original work and the magnum opus of the world's leading political scientist on the topic. How lucky we are to have him. Professor O'Leary also advised on the Good Friday Agreement, and he is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and of the US Council on Foreign Relations. The other speaker this evening is Professor Oran Doyle, who comes from our own law school. And he is a leading national and international scholar on constitutional law. His book, The Irish Constitution, A Contextual Analysis, was published in 2018. But he was head of our law school from 2014 to 2018. And Oran has also advised on many constitutional issues, and he actually participated actively in advising on the Citizens' Assembly. So to start off our conversation this evening, could I ask you, Brendan, why is reunification back on the agenda? And when, if ever, do you think it will happen?
Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you, Yvonne, for that generous introduction. I think that there are three factors putting reunification on the political agenda, not imminently, but in the medium term. First of all, demographic change is taking place in Northern Ireland and will be consolidated in the decade ahead. In that decade, for the first time, Northern Ireland will have a cultural Catholic majority. That is to say, people of coming from Catholic families will constitute an overall majority. It may indeed be a significant time lag before they then constitute an electoral majority, but I don't think it's going to be too far behind. Now, there is no automatic rule that says demography is destiny. Not all Catholics are nationalists. Not all Protestants are unionists. Nevertheless, there's a highly significant correlation. So that trajectory will be ticking away in the background in the next decade. Secondly, we are dealing with the repercussions of the United Kingdom's secession from the European Union. I call it that, rather than the technical term withdrawal from a treaty. That secession is going to have reverberations throughout the next decade. It's already had significant impacts. And one of those impacts has been to detach liberal Protestants from their traditional allegiance to unionist parties. We've seen a growth in the support for the others. And that's the third factor, that both among cultural Catholics and cultural Protestants, there is the growth of those who appear not to wish to align with either the traditional nationalist or traditionalist unionist blocs. Those people heavily identify with being European. So if we think forward to a world in which the pandemic has been resolved through vaccinations, and we are dealing with the economic repercussions of the UK's departure from the EU, in that scenario, I strongly expect Ireland to look like a much more attractive place than a narrow, insular Great Britain. Those are the things that I believe are putting reunification on the agenda. That doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen. My last question I have to answer is, what's my best estimate? I think there's at least a 2 in 3 chance of a referendum before the end of the decade. I don't like to predict referendum outcomes because campaigns matter, the rules matter. But I think unlike any other previous period since the formation of Northern Ireland, I now think that the prospects of Irish reunification are very strong.
Thanks, Brendan, for that oversight of the issues and sort of how we've got to where we are. Just to open up the conversation a bit, how would this happen? Like, what does the Good Friday Agreement have to say about the unification process?
Good question, Oran. The initiative lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. He or she must come to a judgment that opinion has significantly shifted against the Union and in favour of Irish reunification. So that's the trigger or the initiating moment. What's interesting about this, and I don't know what you think about it, is I believe a lot of the Irish political class, those elected to Doyle Oran, imagine that Ireland has some kind of veto over when the process begins. I think it's very interesting that the initiative lies with the UK Secretary of State, then Ireland has to respond. And in my view, that's what creates the imperative for Ireland to do extensive preparation and planning.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you see a lot of political statements by people from different political parties in the South recently about, this isn't on the agenda for X period of time, which may well be true, but they sometimes talk as if they control the agenda. And they don't. As you say, the initiative lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, but not in his or her total discretion, as you say, so that there is a legal obligation in the agreement, which is then actually brought into UK law under the Northern Ireland Act, that they have to call that referendum in the North if it appears likely to them that a majority would vote in favour. Now, that's not the most cut and dried standard in the world, right. So there'll be a large amount of latitude, I think, but this is a train that, the thing with it in one sense, I think Tony Blair used this, the analogy of the train leaving the station in the context of the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. This is a train that could leave the station without either government wanting it to leave the station. And that, I think, does put this onus on planning.
I absolutely agree. And you're the lawyer here, I'm the political scientist. I can't tell you which piece of objective evidence the Secretary of State would invoke. Would it be a series of surveys, proper probability stratified surveys, PACA surveys? Would it be a series of opinion polls, which are less methodologically reliable? Would it be electoral outcomes in the Northern Ireland Assembly or in elections to the Westminster Parliament? All of these are, it seems to me, reasonable indicators, but there isn't one obvious one to which he or she has to respond.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think part of the reason why that's right is that the question that the Secretary of State has to ask is not what do a majority of people think today, but how would a majority of people vote when the referendum is put to them. And as you say, campaigns matter, so there's an element of guesstimate, I suppose, going on, and therefore you draw on. So on the one hand, properly done surveys are probably the best assessment of where the picture is today, but the attitudes of political parties are perhaps relevant in deciding how might that picture evolve.
Right. So we know that leaders can influence public opinion. So if there's a significant level of confidence beyond the expected quarter that would want a referendum, namely Sinn Féin, that a referendum should be held, I think that would weigh heavily.
Yeah. So let's then just chat a little bit about how this plays out down south. Okay, so there's quite a lot in the agreement and in the Northern Ireland Act about the process for, as you say, for the Secretary of State triggering it in Northern Ireland. The Irish Constitution, so it's clear from the agreement that there has to be consent north and south. Okay, and if there isn't consent either north or south, Northern Ireland stays within the United Kingdom. So that's a fundamental part of the constitutional settlement of the 98 agreement, or the constitutional compromise. But what's the process for ascertaining consent of people in the South? Do you have any views on that?
I think I'm the amateur in constitutional law compared to you, but as I read it, I think the Irish state would be entitled, if it chose to proceed with unification solely on the basis of a resolution in Doyle, Oran, democratically expressed. But I think that would be unwise. The spirit of the 98 agreement was to have everything ratified north and south in double referendums. And I think that logic would carry forward, not least because if there are specific constitutional amendments that need to be made in Ireland before there will be reunification, then those will automatically require the people to consent. So I think it's wise to expect a double referendum process, and I think the electorate expect that. So if Doyle Oran were to be rash enough to proceed without double referendums, I think they would be endangering their positions.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree on your read of the politics of the situation. I would say, however, that I think constitutionally a referendum is required as well, not strictly to allow for unification, but because under the Good Friday Agreement, there are obligations that persist in the event of unification. And some of those, at least as I read them, this is open to some contestation, are about an entitlement of people in the North to remain as British citizens, not to have Irish citizenship foisted on them against their will, and yet to be treated as political equals. And at the moment, there are rights that you only get in the Irish state if you are Irish citizens, the right to vote in referendums, to elect the president. And I think there would need to be constitutional amendments to give effect to those in the context of unification. So I think both legally and politically, we're looking at referendums. There's then interesting questions. So in the agreement, it refers to the need for the concurrent expression of consent. And there's some debate around that. And does it mean that they have to be on the same day, as was the case with the Good Friday referendums back in Good Friday Agreement referendums in 1998, or can they be staggered in any way? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I just want to say on the previous topic, how much our views converge. I think the critical question for Ireland will be what constitutional securities it's going to make available to cultural Protestants and people of British descent. And if you make any inspection of the Irish Constitution, it's likely to be the case that there will be some changes necessary. So we agree. I think that the interpretation of concurrent is straightforward if you're a political scientist. It means that two parties at least must jointly make a decision on the same question. but it doesn't need to be simultaneous on the side of both partners. After all, a decision is made in the US Congress by the concurrent agreement of the two houses, but they don't necessarily vote on the same day, but they have to vote on the same substantive matter. So I would say that there can certainly be an interval between the two referendums, North and South.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that. And just to draw out, I think, well, there's a couple of implications of that we might draw out later, but the immediate one is a question might arise. Suppose, I think there could be good arguments for having them on the same day, but suppose there's not. Suppose we're in this situation, perhaps even where the Northern Secretary of State doesn't particularly want there to be a referendum, but has lost a court case and been compelled to draw one. I think court would be reluctant to do that, but it could ultimately happen. And the Secretary of State goes ahead and there's a referendum. The Irish government doesn't particularly want one either, let's imagine. The Secretary of State goes ahead, calls the referendum, it's carried in the North. In my view, there is then a constitutional obligation on the Irish state under the Constitution to hold a referendum in the South. Okay, so this is my analogy of the train leaving the station. You know, it can be always subject to the consent of the people, North and South, and that's absolute. But there are limited powers for government actors to stop it once it has started. And that again reinforces the need to be thinking now about the sorts of issues that should be addressed.
I agree entirely. There's a constitutional obligation on the South to proceed in the light of a positive vote for unification in the North. And that reinforces the need to start planning and preparation now. After all, we all think now, given this horrific global pandemic, that it would have been better if we'd done long-term planning. And in this case, you're using the train analogy. The train is moving, it's on the horizon. It's not necessarily going to arrive at a particular destination, but we should plan for it.
Yeah, and even, I think this can create some problems because obviously planning is not without political significance. So we might talk a little bit about the Brexit referendum. Obviously, one of the problems with the way in which the Brexit referendum was done was that David Cameron, I think, had prohibited planning within the civil service on the implementation of a vote to leave. But there were political reasons for him to not want the civil service planning that. And in the same way, in the context of any consideration of Irish unification, there are good reasons why, if you're opposed to unification, you would prefer it not to be planned for.
Yeah, I think the comparison with the Brexit referendum is entirely appropriate here. If, irrespective of our view on whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, what the public was being offered in the UK was a choice between a known option and a potentially infinite array of other possibilities. So it will be vital that Ireland either clarifies what model of reunification it wants to proceed with, or instead to identify precisely what constitutional process it will follow in the event of a vote for unification, North and South. I notice that Oran's screen has frozen. I will wait for him to come back, and I will continue to answer the question in the hope that he will resume shortly. I think you've heard that both Oran and I agree that the initiative lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and I think that's a very important point for thinking and reflecting in the South. And as I've already suggested, the key choice for the South is between articulating a specific model of the Constitution. Is it to be confederal? Is it to be federal? Is it to be a unitary state? And if so, what type of unitary state or what type of federation? All that requires extensive pre-planning. And the alternative possibility is to leave open those choices until such time as there's a constitutional process, North and South. Oran, while you've been away, I've been elaborating at leisure on the distinction between choosing between a model and a process, which I think is fundamentally a choice to be made in Dublin.
Yeah, so apologies for that. Had a bit of a Wi-Fi dropout there. Now back. Yeah, so I think the alternative, which is to be avoided to the model or the process, is if it's not planned at all, and that's the analogy. I'm not sure if you haven't spoken about that, but that's where it looks like the Brexit situation. So you can imagine a vote in the north and the south, even simultaneously, where they vote in principle on the issue of unification, and then the day after, you're saying, well, what does unification mean? Then you have negotiations to try to work it out, but that's hugely problematic.
It is. There is, I think, one difference with the UK's Brexit vote, namely that there is a default option for Irish reunification, the Constitution of Ireland. But if there were to be a rapid referendum with no serious thinking, we're basically confined to two options based on the existing constitution. One is a centralized unitary state. Northern Ireland would be absorbed. It's presumably the subsequent decisions on the character of local government would have to be made. But in effect, there would be the model of a united Ireland that has long been in many people's heads, a 32-county unified republic. The alternative possibility present in the Constitution of Ireland is the provision that allows for subordinate legislatures, which De Valera inserted deliberately with the prospect of Irish reunification in mind. So the Constitution is prepared for the absorption of a Northern Ireland Assembly functioning in the north. But I believe, and you have thought about this in a way that I haven't, I believe that there are constitutional constraints on absorbing the Northern Ireland executive into a united Ireland. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's again an area of difficult constitutional interpretation. As you say, it's fairly clear that the Oireachtas could create a devolved legislature in Belfast. Effectively, it could continue Stormont. But it's not so clear that it can create a devolved executive. The general rule under the Constitution is the executive cannot give away its own power. It would seem to me to be straining the text of the Constitution to allow the Oireachtas effectively create a substitute executive or a subsidiary executive, subordinate executive in Belfast. I think in a way, a lot of those questions will become moot if there's any planning at all, because as you were saying, there's probably going to be a referendum. And if there is, assuming any of this goes ahead, if there is a referendum, these are the sorts of things that you would sort out. Okay, so you would, if you wanted to continue devolution in Northern Ireland, if that was the choice that we wanted to put before the Irish people, you would ensure that there was a set of constitutional amendments that would guarantee that that could continue. What are the other issues, do you think, that if the constitutional issues or others that should be addressed if there was a move towards unification, what sort of issues do you think we should be thinking about?
Well, I think it's vital that Ireland realizes that the initiative lies with it on the question of choice of model or process. Obviously, the two come together at some juncture because a process leads to a specific model, but Ireland has to think that through. The downside of choosing a model in advance is that the North doesn't get a say directly in the design of the model, except of course it's going to vote for unification with the knowledge that that's the specific model that the South has in mind. And it will know that in future, the North as a whole will constitute a third of the electorate. So it will have a significant role to play in future Irish politics, including in future constitutional amendments. So the downside of choosing a specific model is the North does not get to select directly the model it might most prefer.
I could come in on that, and maybe I think what follows from your qualification, it's not so much, in my view, that the North doesn't have a role, because it will be able to, it'll have the same role as the South in terms of the people giving their consent or not. But it's more around the incentives for unionist participation. If you're a unionist, you oppose a United Ireland for sincerely held views, very reasonably, you won't want to be involved in any discussion about the shape of a United Ireland before the referendums take place. So while the Irish government could organise all sorts of things that would allow this model to be worked out, there could be citizens' assemblies, north and south, however you want to do it. I think the reality of the situation is that certainly unionist leadership, unionist political parties, but I think like broad swathes of the unionist population community just wouldn't want to be involved. And from their perspective, quite rightly and quite legitimately and quite understandably. So it's that sort of, but if they then find themselves, if unification were to go ahead, then they're living in a state that they haven't had much opportunity to contribute to the design to. So I'd see the issue a little bit in that way.
I understand that. Of course, if that scenario played out, that would be the outcome of their own choices. But they shouldn't be punished for that, but it would be the outcome of their own choices. I think the interesting feature is whether there will develop among unionists, one category, and among cultural Protestants, another category, a debate on whether to have an insurance policy about what kind of United Ireland they prefer in the event of it happening. So Peter Robinson, it seems to me, the former leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, a recent First Minister, he is clearly not of the ostrich tendency. He is arguing that unionists should be ready to argue for the union, but they should also think about the possibility of United Ireland. So far, nobody is joining him. I think that will change over the decade ahead, and I think that will then create constructive possibilities for the Irish government to engage the cultural Protestant and the unionist communities. But you are right; they could find themselves in a United Ireland, but they played no role in its design, and others have, in effect, paternalistically made decisions with their rights in mind. One of the interesting things is that social science has something to contribute here. Together with John Gary and others, we had an experiment in which we gave a sample of the population of Northern Ireland a choice between a centralised unitary state and a decentralised unitary state in which Northern Ireland would persist. And we expected that those of a Protestant background would prefer to keep Northern Ireland in the event of a United Ireland. And that was indeed the case in the first round of the experiment. But then when we discussed the difficulties attached to each model, a significant number of the Protestant participants changed their minds for two reasons, I think. One is they questioned the existing power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland, whether they were viable, functional, and effective. And secondly, some of them thought through the fact that in a united Ireland, Protestants as a whole would be 1/6 of the island. And if there were to be a persisting government in Northern Ireland, they might find themselves a minority inside Northern Ireland, inside the whole of Ireland. So some of them thought they might have more influence in all island coalitions in Doyle Oran, rather than being subordinated to Sinn Féin inside Northern Ireland. Now, I'm not saying that predicts how things will go in the next decade, but it is interesting. Unionist and Protestant preferences may be more malleable than we might think about what particular version of a united Ireland they prefer.
Yeah, and I think that also leads us to think about the issue of devolution from the Southern perspective. So I think a lot of people in the South assume, and it will be a significant gesture of goodwill as well, subject to what you were just saying, that devolution should continue. in the north within a united Ireland. And there's a lot to recommend that, notwithstanding what you just said in terms of continuity around if there were unification, sovereignty transfers, but not that much changes on the ground. And I think we can all see how that might be stabilizing. But it does pose significant issues for the running of the national state if there is devolution, one-sided devolution to one part of the country only, and where that makes up roughly a third of the population. So some of these issues have already played out in the United Kingdom. They talk about the West Lothian question, which is why should an MP from Scotland have a say in the House of Commons on matters that are devolved to Scotland? Why should that MP be allowed to speak on those matters as they affect England? There's a democratic representation problem there. If we imagine it as the West Belfast question, that problem is there as well. So how would people, suppose there's continuing devolution, the Stormont executive deals with matters of health, how would people in the South feel about the TD for West Belfast, whoever that might be, getting a vote on health issues relating to the South when nobody in the South has a vote on health issues relating to the North? Have you, sorry, I say have you, I know you have, so tell us what your thoughts are on this issue.
I think you put your finger on a vital question, precisely because Northern Ireland is 1/3 of a future united Ireland. The West Lothian question becomes a much bigger question in the entire Irish polity. By contrast, if you add Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland together inside the UK, they're 15% of the overall UK population. Therefore, to use the technical term, certain amounts of asymmetry are quite easy to deal with. I think in a united Ireland, it'll be very tough to deal with the West Lothian question with 1/3 of deputies, in effect, having more power than 2/3 of deputies. And the issue will be compounded if, at least in the initial years, there were significant financial transfers from the South to the North, which is, I think, what most people would reasonably expect, allowing for possible transformations over the next decade. So that could set up considerable tensions, and it might lead to people saying, all right, let's have, in the South, Southern deputies only will vote on Southern questions, and Northern deputies will only vote on Northern questions. And then the only issues to be decided will be external relations, broadly speaking. And if that kind of logic begins to prevail, then thinking about a federal design might start to make more sense and wouldn't have the problems attached to asymmetrical representation, at least not necessarily.
What you mentioned there reminds me of the approach that they've now adopted in the UK, partially to deal with the West Lothian question, which they call English votes for English laws. So if there are laws that solely affect England within the United Kingdom, they go through the usual stages in the House of Commons, but then I believe there's a final stage, which is a committee of all of the MPs from England who have to approve it. But what that has introduced into the UK system, I haven't really seen the effects of it yet, but you must have, if a government is to have a governing majority, it needs to have a governing majority both for England and for the United Kingdom as a whole.
Right.
And this is where the scale issue would be much more significant in Ireland. We've seen how difficult it has been after the last two general elections to have a government with a majority in the Dáil as it stands. But that government would now have a majority that would function for the 26 counties to enact some measures, and also for the 32 counties to enact other measures. So there could be a lot of, there's a lot of issues that need to be worked out if devolution is going to continue.
In effect, there could be two different coalition governments, depending on the questions, which isn't most people's idea of reunification.
And there can't be two governments. So the government trying to put together competing or different legislative coalitions depending on which measures it wants to introduce.
It would be Scandinavian politics, but double. In Scandinavia, it's not uncommon for there to be a minority government but for legislation to require majorities in Parliament to go through. But in this case, there were two different legislative majorities.
Yeah, yeah. Fun for the political scientists, anyway. So,
don't go there.
Keep the profession in work. Other issues that I think people talk about a lot and that you see coming up from the constitutional perspective are the provisions in the Irish Constitution that reflect a very mono-ethnic state. So written in 1937, the Irish people are defined largely by who they struggled against. They're not named as the British, but we know that's who's in mind. The Irish flag is green, white, and orange. Not a flag that has, a flag that is not supported in any way by the Unionist population, Unionist community in the north. Irish language titles for the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, Irish as the national language. These are constitutional provisions that people talk about as being, on the table for negotiation, or where an effort should be made in the South to try to have a constitution more accommodating of those from a Unionist background. What are your thoughts about those?
I think that anybody who looks at the preface today would argue that it's not simply mono-ethnic in character, but it has a mono-religious tint that is out of kilter with opinion in both parts of the island. Redrafting a preface is an arcane constitutional subject, which I'll leave to you, but plainly, I don't think any model of a united Ireland should persist with the existing preface. The flag is bound to be a controversial subject. It will be weakened as an issue if there is a distinct Northern Ireland flag preserved for the Northern Ireland polity, perhaps even conceivably two versions of a Northern Ireland flag if necessary. It has to be recalled, and I'm trying to not be aligned with one side here, the Irish flag deliberately represents the orange and the green and peace in between them. That the flag is perhaps insufficiently inclusive of those who do not come from the green or orange traditions, but there is already a serious effort in that flag to represent the Irish Protestant identity. But there will be a case for redesigning the flag. There's a role for artists there in thinking about a new flag if the South wishes to be supremely generous. I think a choice of a different national anthem is not beyond the Irish public. I think the equal recognition of three languages might be necessary: English, Irish, and Ulster Scots, if demanded. Those things can all be considered and should be considered. There are different formulae for how they might work. I think it would be important for Irish reunification not to destabilize those who are very satisfied with the existing republic. So it will be a tricky matter to negotiate, but all these questions certainly have to be discussed and addressed.
I think there is that risk of destabilizing. So there's a sense in which measures that may make the state more sympathetic or more attractive to people from one tradition, at least if implemented clumsily, could push away people from a different tradition. I was teaching this topic with my constitutional law students earlier this semester, and not a high quality opinion poll or survey of the type you were talking about, but there was widespread support for unification in the class, running at about 5-1, but also about 4-1 against making changes to these sorts of symbolic issues, these things of Irish identity that are reflected in the Constitution and that for people in the South are very important aspects of their political identity. And I think certainly anybody who is interested in unification and who thinks that is worth pursuing needs to start getting their heads around these issues.
We should avoid silly formulae like drafting an Ulster Scots version of the Soldier's Song. Silly things should not be contemplated, but imaginative things can be contemplated. There are two versions of Singing for Ireland in Rugby Union. Could there be a variety of options, depending on the occasion, for the singing of the national anthem? Could there be a different version sung in Ulster as opposed to the rest of the island? These are tough questions, and I think what we're both saying in different ways is we would want to avoid these becoming zero-sum questions, if at all possible. I think the flag will be the most difficult one for the South to contemplate changeover, not the anthem, not the position of Irish. I think as long as Irish is fully respected, it will be less important that it be primary. I think that could be managed successfully. So I would say the flag will be the touchy question, but I might be wrong about that.
And then maybe just finally, because I think we're coming to the end of our time before we open it up for questions, is really just to connect these issues of substance that we've been talking about towards the end with the issues of process at the start. So imagine it happening in a rushed, unplanned way, where it's triggered not by a collaboration between the governments applying the test laid down in law, but with a sense that the views of the people should be asked on this issue, but instead it gets prompted by a court decision or something like that. That sort of environment where there's a sudden headlong rush towards a referendum would be an incredibly difficult environment to start exploring these constitutional questions about what the continuation of devolution would mean should there be changes made to the Irish flag, for example. So I think the discussion of the substance perhaps reinforces the points that we were making in the start and that you were dealing with while I was off dealing with Wi-Fi issues about the need to plan in some way, whether that's putting forward a model before the referendums or a clear process as to how such a model could be designed after the referendums. I think
if we go back to that, if you don't mind, if we go back to that discussion of the choice between model or process, if we look at the process option, that's very difficult for an Irish government to manage. It must propose that there will be a constitutional convention after unification. It may make it open-ended, but there will have to be a decision rule attached to that constitutional convention, with the default being the Constitution of Ireland. That will all have to be articulated in some clearly accessible popular language so that people know what they're voting for when they vote for some novel constitutional process for redesigning the Constitution of a United Ireland. And there will be a lot of people, I think, on both sides of the border would be unhappy at not knowing what they're voting for if you vote for a relatively open-ended process. So my guess as a political scientist, not because it's my own normative preference, my guess as a political scientist is that the South will choose a specific model so that there will be greater clarity on what people are voting for, North and South. But I fully accept that that's debatable.
Did you want to add something to that, Oran?
No, I'm very happy to move on to questions.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
There are lots and lots of questions, some of which you've answered in the course, and in which case just say yes or no, okay? Anyway, the first one is thinking outside the GFA box. Is unification of the island and the creation of a unitary state the only option under consideration? What about a federal state with perhaps Scotland?
Well, first of all, a federation is, I think, a viable option. It would not be easy to put on the agenda of the referendum question for unification, because a lot of questions would have to be decided first. What are the units of the federation? If they're Northern Ireland and the Republic, that's a 2-unit federation, and those have a very poor track record for some of the questions that, for some of the reasons that Oran and I addressed when we were talking about a devolved Northern Ireland inside a united Ireland. But I think federation over the long run has many worthwhile attributes. People sometimes say Ireland is too small to be federal. Well, Switzerland and Belgium are very successful small European democracies, and they're very, very federal in character. And there is enough regional variation in Ireland to merit thinking about a federal option. So the critical question there would be, is Northern Ireland going to be a unit, or is the whole of the island of Ireland going to be recomposed into different federal units? One possibility is to restore the historic provinces, not something that I think would particularly enthuse Northern Irish Protestants. It would appear to them as if they were being swamped in a bigger majority of their historical adversaries. Or should we have a city-region model in which each big city around the coasts has a distinct region attached to it based on a whole range of geographic criteria? So I, for one, would welcome a discussion on federation, but I would expect that to occur after Ireland had already been unified. You put the nice question about Scotland in there. I think if Scotland were to secede from the UK, which I would expect to happen before Irish reunification, we have an interesting choice as the Irish Republic, irrespective of whether a unified Ireland has been created. If we confederated with the Scots, it's conceivable that that's their fastest route into the European Union, because they'd be part of us in some sense. And then we let them go their own way, which I presume they would prefer, rather than to be potentially governed by us, because a united Ireland would be bigger in population than Scotland. What's the point of leaving the United Kingdom to be governed by others? But there are all sorts of creative things the Irish and the Scots could do together to be mutually beneficial.
Okay. I'll ask you this one, Oran. The identity question post-unification is a good one. Many unionists, this means many people in Northern Ireland, may choose not to take Irish citizenship. But one issue is, will British citizenship be there because Britain is no longer a single state? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, so under the Good Friday Agreement, there is an obligation on the UK that the people can continue to be British or Irish, irrespective of which is the sovereign government. Okay, so that they would be entitled under the Good Friday Agreement to continue as British citizens. And I think certainly that's one obligation. Some concerns as to whether the UK meets its international law obligations at the moment, but I think this is one that it would meet in the short term and probably even in the medium term. But to start thinking about this further and further along the line, like beyond our lifetimes, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, is the UK still going to be giving citizenship to the descendants of people that were part of it all those years ago? And how does this hold up if England would be the successor state if there were a complete dissolution of the United Kingdom? But things might start to look different. So I think that's not something that anybody should be too concerned about in the short term. But in the long term, I think there might be a few questions around that.
Yeah. Do you think people will have citizenship of both countries? Will they be allowed both double citizenship?
Yeah. Dual citizenship is allowed for people in Northern Ireland and will be allowed in the future. I think the bigger challenge for us from a constitutional perspective, it is how do you allow people who do not want to be Irish citizens still be politically equal within a unified state? And there's ways of dealing with that, but I think that's the technical problem to be solved.
Okay, right. This question is addressed to you, Brendan, but Oran may have something too about it. Apart from the Shared Ireland unit focusing on joint economic projects, what are some things that the Republic could do to plan and prepare for Irish unity?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yvonne. Mm-hmm. I have advocated, and no doubt I will be mocked for doing so, that Ireland should have a Ministry of National Reunification. If unification happens, and I emphasize it's contingent, it will affect every aspect of public policy, law, and external relations in Ireland, maybe much less dramatically in some domains than others. It cuts across existing government departments. Northern Ireland, very shortly, shouldn't be a subject for the Department of Foreign Affairs because it could conceivably be a question of domestic politics. A small unit in the Prime Minister's office, the Taoiseach's office, is an excellent beginning. And as I understand it, its research objectives are not deeply restricted, so I hope it will look at broader questions. But I would hope in the longer run that a ministry would be built to plan all sorts of contingent public policy questions, to engage citizens north and south in citizens' assemblies, to contemplate various constitutional transformations. I got this idea not out of my own head, but from a PhD student whom I supervised. She is the head of the women's unit in the Korean Ministry of National Reunification. Korea faces an appallingly difficult problem of reunification if the North were to collapse after decades of dictatorship. Northern Ireland won't bear any resemblance to North Korea, but the Koreans are sufficiently aware of the serious tasks ahead of them that they've had a Ministry of National Reunification for decades, including focusing on questions related to women's rights and how they will be integrated in a new order. So I would argue that the question is so existentially and momentously grave for the existing Republic of Ireland that nothing less than a ministry is required. Not tomorrow, but I do believe it should be set up as soon as possible.
Right. What would you say about that, Oran?
Yeah, so I broadly agree with that. I'll just add a different thought that's prompted by the question and the answer rather than a direct response, which is that sometimes it's assumed, and I don't think the questioner was, and Brendan certainly wasn't, that it's a question of working out how to amalgamate the existing structures of the North into the ones that exist for the current Irish state. But I think any sort of planning for unification should be much more open-minded than that. Certainly a huge amount of thought was put into the structure of the PSNI for the North. Certainly several years ago, perhaps things are improving now with the new structures in the South. There were huge concerns about An Garda Síochána and the whistleblower controversy and so on. So it'd be an open question as to whether it'd be better to just hypothetically amalgamate An Garda Síochána into the PSNI rather than vice versa. So it's an opportunity to look at what is working well on different sides of the border. Perhaps the National Health Service model in the North should be the model for the entire state. Perhaps the education system in the South is better and should be the model, and also the scope for continuing diversity. So just to...
I couldn't agree more. If unification is seen as a southern annexation of the North and the simple export of everything in the South to the North, it won't work well. Reunification should be a moment for collective appraisal in the South, and reunification ideally should be the best of existing practices, North and South.
And that model of just absorption, I think, has been very problematic for Germany.
Indeed.
And there are a few, there's 25 more questions. We won't have time for all of them. So just give a yes or no, or we can't say answer to these. Will Irish citizens living abroad have a vote in the referendum in the South?
I believe their voting rights will be the same as their voting rights for Doyle Aaron. But Oran will correct me on that.
Yeah, no greater rights than at present. So it would have to be changed to the existing thing, which I don't expect.
Okay. What will happen, Royal soldiers from Northern Ireland?
Royal soldiers, did you say?
Yeah, I don't know what Royal soldiers are.
So when these things have happened historically, troops from Northern Ireland who are part of the British forces will have a choice to continue working for British forces elsewhere, or they will be offered opportunities to join the Irish Army. And that's an interesting subject as well. Would the Irish Army remain completely integrated and all island? Would it have specific territorial units in order to build collective identities? We obviously don't want Irish reunification to be associated with a monstrously large army. That would not be good. But it does offer opportunities to think through how you incorporate those who might be losing their careers, particularly in the British Army.
Oh, right. Do you think the United States or the EU will play a greater role in mediating a reunification process?
I think we haven't discussed this so far, but both Oran and I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between questions related to the transfer of sovereignty from Northern Ireland to United Ireland, those questions, and those questions that attach to Irish reunification. So in questions of the transfer of sovereignty, what's the three most important questions are citizenship rights, secondly, the evaluation of the net assets and liabilities of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, and thirdly, maritime boundaries. Those are the classic issues associated with a secession or breakup, but they also attach to a withdrawal of sovereignty. And I can imagine the necessity of mediation attached to those questions, where both the European Union and the US could play a positive role. But at the moment, the current Conservative government, as everyone knows, is allergic to European involvement. It may be less allergic to US involvement. So when we think about a mediation role, I think we need to think about it in relationship to either of those goals, the transfer of sovereignty or questions of Irish reunification. There's also mediation roles that conceivably could arise for thinking through questions related to how the questions are posed, how referendum campaigns are going to be regulated, how you create, as best as possible, a common democratic space across the island to ensure a fair referendum. There are multiple opportunities for welcoming the role of positive mediation, if, of course, the two governments and local parties agree to that.
Okay. This question I'll put to you, Oran. The partition of Ireland allowed the partition of Ulster. Many Donegal Protestants left Donegal. The majority of Donegal Protestants remained and became loyal and engaged citizens of the Republic. If we go to a federal solution, could we in Donegal and Cavan and Monaghan have the option to become part of the successor polity to Northern Ireland?
Anything is possible. But if I think for reasons Brendan was talking about earlier, if a federal structure is going to emerge, I think it would be done in some way to assuage concerns of unionists in Northern Ireland. And those concerns aren't going to be assuaged by having a unit that is Ulster, because then they would be very definitely within a minority. So I think it's very unlikely that that would become the federal structure of a new state, the four historic provinces.
Okay. This one, both of you can choose to do this one. Cultural and political identity are very important. Economic status is not discussed much. How important is it that public services and institutions are mirrored? For example, the loss of the National Health Service and the inheritance of a very broken health system here, don't we know, would not be very attractive. So will we get the best of both?
So economic questions will be fundamental. They'll be fundamental in any future referendum campaigning. I think what people don't realize, and it's understandable amid the pandemic, is the dramatic transformations of comparative economic positions looked at over the long run. The Republic is now, by historic standards, extraordinarily prosperous. And I would confidently predict that it will do better after the pandemic is over and after the UK has seceded from the European Union than the UK as a whole will do. That said, Northern Ireland now performs on some indicators better than Wales and some parts of the north of England. So we shouldn't have in our mindset some static picture that the Republic is an astonishingly successful tiger and Northern Ireland is a complete basket case. The gap between the Republic and Northern Ireland, if my memory is correct, is less than the gap between Germany and East Germany. Now, that doesn't mean everything's going to be easy in the course in handling questions related to economic unification. But the specific issue raised was one of public services. Now, one thing I can tell you as a comparative political scientist, no public is really happy with their health service anywhere. Whether you go with the nationalized model, as in the UK, it is loved, but people complain all the time about it being underfunded. Private insurance schemes are advocated particularly by those minded towards market economics, and you get divergent public appraisals of them. I think this is an opportunity for both parts of Ireland to have a serious debate about what kind of public health service they want to have in the future. And in any case, irrespective of this question, reunification, we're so close, we're on the same island. There's a whole range of things we should plan together. And the areas that you were talking about, Cavan, Monaghan, Donegal, plainly a lot of public health planning should take place with the idea that Derry and Fermanagh are contiguous zones for the supply of public health services.
Thank you. The next one is, how do you think of Ireland's call as a new national anthem?
No.
How about you, Brendan? Yes or no?
I think it's a bit corny.
Okay. Well, anyway, the very different welfare systems in the two jurisdictions seem a problem to me with their financial implications. What protections could exist to protect advantages?
It's a good question, and it's one reason I would argue for a Ministry of National Reunification. There are different social policy developments that have occurred north and south. It's my understanding that Ireland is, broadly speaking, more generous towards children than the regime in the north. I would like to see that spread north. There are other aspects of social policy in the north and the UK, which are more generous than those in the Republic. There should be an honest appraisal of what's best in both places.
Yeah.
The dynamic question here is, should we assume that Northern Ireland is going to remain economically backward in relationship to the rest of the island? Or can we think of positive ways in which reunification will actually boost economic growth, boost employment, boost labour market skills in the north, akin to those in the south, so that we will have less need to deal with certain kinds of social policy question?
Right. Okay. The next question is rather like this a bit. Could the Republic possibly hold a referendum to make capital movable and therefore liable to offer to move the government to Belfast as a sign of goodwill and as an innovative way to address the Dublin-centric layout? Has such an option ever been discussed?
So
both of you can answer that. Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Oran? You're the Dubliner.
It can be done. There's been some discussion that Armagh perhaps could be a compromise, historic capital. So yeah, it could certainly be done. These are things that should be talked about.
I agree, and I think Armagh is a sensible choice if you're thinking about a federal design. I think if you have another mode of thought, you don't have to, on a small island, have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary all located within 50 yards of one another. Why not have the Supreme Court in Armagh? Why not have the Senate sitting in Belfast while the First Chamber sits in Dublin? There are all sorts of ways we can be imaginative on our institutional arrangements. And I do think there is a strong sentiment outside Dublin that can be tapped for decentralization.
Okay.
So it's at this moment that we lost all the senior counsel on the call, on the webinar.
I was going to suggest
could I give them Athlone instead? Would that change their mind?
Or Cork. Anyway.
I'm a Cork boy.
Any thoughts on disallowing individuals from voting either side of the border? Or just to stop people twice.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting questions we didn't explore, what the franchise would be for the referendums. And certainly if each side just goes about it, using the existing franchises, then you could have somebody who's entitled to vote in both jurisdictions. Oddly, this should be theoretically more troubling from somebody who's committed, like a strong Irish nationalist committed to unification, because they should see this as one polity making a joint decision. Whereas if you're somebody opposed to unification, theoretically you should be more relaxed about this, because I think you see it as two different polities making decisions. Whereas pragmatically, your attitudes should shift, I think, because somebody who can vote in both sides is probably more likely to favour unification. I think this is something that can't be fixed on the Irish side without having to do a referendum first. It's just too difficult to disentangle the Dáil franchise from the referendum franchise. And I think it's very unlikely, if we were ever to go down this road, that there's going to be a pre-referendum to amend the voting rules. So if this is to be addressed, it probably would have to be addressed unilaterally in the north, saying you cannot vote in the north if you're also an elector in the south. But what the correct position should be, I'm not sure.
I agree with Oran. You'd have to have a uniform franchise and agreement on all of that. You'd have to, in effect, agree an all-Ireland polity before you made that kind of ruling. Administratively, it's quite easy. You just get somebody's finger with an indelible stain once they've voted once. And unless somebody invents some brilliant scheme for removing indelible ink, that would be the mechanism you could apply. That, of course, would only apply to in-person voting. It doesn't apply to mail-in voting.
Okay. In the 70s, a small number of unionists, inspired by Rhodesia, flirted with the idea of a unilateral declaration of independence. Does the legal framework allow for such a third option in the case of a referendum?
The Good Friday Agreement is unambiguous. There are only two options: the United Ireland or the preservation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There's no joint sovereignty option. There's no independence option. And if I may segue off the good question, if you think about a confederation, that would involve two sovereign states on the island, Northern Ireland and the Republic, sharing common functions in a confederation of Ireland. Now, historically, Ireland has never wanted to accept the possibility of an independent sovereign state in Northern Ireland. So it would have that obstacle to get over. In addition, I think a confederation, though it has some advantages, would create potential difficulties with European Union membership. One of the advantages of voting for Irish reunification for people in the north is immediate re-entry into the European Union. If instead Northern Ireland has to go through a protracted process of becoming an independent state and then confederalizing with Ireland, those tricky questions might emerge. But the serious question that's also attached to this issue is the threat of violence. Now, we know that there were serious plans, not only in the 70s, but in the early 90s by the UDA to engage in ethnic expulsions of cultural Catholics and to carve out a northeastern statelet that would be independent and would presumably depend on 4 counties. I think what makes that incredibly improbable is very significant change demographically. Northern Ireland's population remains segregated, but the presence of cultural Catholics in very significant numbers in the Northeast makes that independence fantasy no longer viable. Belfast is shortly to be, in fact, it already is a culturally Catholic majority city. That's extraordinary. To have a Northeast of Ireland statelet without Belfast would, I think, be psychologically unacceptable to most unionists. So the territorial possibility of carving out an independent, homogeneous Protestant state isn't really there. unless they can marshal incredible levels of violence. But they can't, because the British Army won't be on their side. The UDA and UBF's military capacity is pretty limited. And the police are now balanced, not as balanced as I would like them to be, but they're in that direction. So the police will not be partial towards one group rather than the other. At least one hopes that will be the case. So I think that possibility is of a lower order of magnitude than it was in the 70s or the 90s.
Okay. There's a couple more questions. Well, there are a lot more questions, but I want to go and take 2 or 3 more. Do you think there'd be a paramilitary backlash to a proposed referendum in the North?
Well, I already got into that question partially. Yeah. There will, I think, be those who wish to close down conversation and to threaten the possibility of a referendum being called, and there could indeed be those who wish to engage in violence after the referendum has been called. There will be, I think, almost no violence that one could expect from the Republican side in this scenario. After all, they would expect and hope that their scenario would materialize of a united Ireland. So we're really talking about the question of loyalist violence. According to Peter Shurlow, who is a professor at Liverpool, and no one would describe him as an Irish nationalist, there are maybe 200 to 250 die-hard people in Northern Ireland with combat training with the British Army. Whether that will still be the case in 10 years' time, whether the British Army will be deployed abroad in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, I'm not going to predict. But I don't think even 200 or 300 fanatical diehards can do sufficient damage to prevent the democratic process going ahead. And I think we should all in Ireland, North and South, lift our eyes up from the historic tragedy of 1966 through to 1998 and look forward to the prospect of resolving our questions democratically. And I also think, just a final thought here on this question, Unionists want to preserve the Union. If it's clear that loyalist paramilitaries are engaged in massacres or bombings as a means of preserving the Union, I don't think that's going to encourage people to vote for their position.
Thank you. That's a very interesting observation and an important question. This is my final question because we're a long time overdue, really, but it's such a fascinating discussion. If Irish unity occurs in the next 10 to 20 years, Oran, you take this one, how will Ireland's relationship with Britain develop over the next 50 years? Might relations become so good that we might one day have a new nation, the Western Isles of Great Britain and Ireland?
Yeah, I think that's unlikely.
Speculative, yeah.
I would hope that, be reasonably confident that relations could be good. I think if United Ireland happens, it is likely that there's going to be an independent Scotland as well. Not quite sure what would happen to Wales. So I think the short-term risk is like what would happen to England in that situation? Would the sort of dynamics that led to Brexit intensify? That might become, people might disagree with this, but more inward-looking, populist style of government, or would England find sort of a new role for itself? Lost an empire looking for a role. What role would England have for itself? And I honestly don't know how that would play out. But I think they're be reasonably optimistic for good relationships. Most optimistic, I think, is actually that after a while, England would want to come back into the European Union as an equal member state along with the others, and that good relations could develop in that way.
That's my hope. Well, I think you've done an amazing job this evening. I'm so impressed by your scholarship and breadth of your knowledge and articulate answers and so on. So on behalf of all of the people listening here, I want to thank you very much for wonderful participation this evening. And good evening to all our alumni. And I'll now hand you over to Garrett.
Thank you, Yvonne. And thank you all for joining us this evening for the last of our Law and Contemporary Challenges webinar conversations. It's been great to have you, and it's a great testament, I think, to the to those who spoke this evening. We've had an incredible attendance and so many questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all.